Today on Community Watch, I'm talking with McCracken Poston, attorney and author, whose book, Zenith Man, Death, Love, and Redemption in the Georgia Courtroom, is a great read. You want to hear the story? Community Watch starts now. Welcome to Community Watch. I am extremely excited to have with me today McCracken Poston. Welcome.
Thank you.
Some folks know you as an attorney from Ringgold, but you are here today as an author, and we're going to talk about your book, and I'm going to read the full title, Zenith Man, Death, Love, and Redemption in a Georgia Courtroom, which came out this year.
In February.
And I got to say, this is a great read. I mean, it is a great read, even without the local interest and the connections to folks who live in northwest Georgia. I mean, especially if you like courtroom dramas, this is a great book. Now, I'm using the Georgia Highlands library edition here, which some lucky person will be able to check out in a couple of days when I return it. But really, you need to get one because it's one of those books you actually, I mean, you might want to read it a couple of times. So we're going to talk about it. All right, the story, I mean, this is a case that you dealt with a few years ago.
25 years ago, the trial ended January 15, 1999.
And for folks who are not familiar with the story, I mean, it was a murder case.
It was.
But there was a great mystery around it, and so much mystery, in fact, that you wonder why they went so far as to say it was a murder. But anyway.
Well, Alvin Ridley was a failed TV repairman, hence the name Zenith Man. That was his brand. There was an old Zenith sign sticking out over his building, which was suddenly shuttered in 1984. Alvin was involved in a number of civil suits where he was suing on behalf of he and his mother. He claimed that his father's death from pancreatic cancer had something to do with a minor car accident from 2 years before. It was the most unusual theory of causation I'd ever seen, but of course, as you would expect, the cases went nowhere, except a counterclaimant briefly seized his 1977 Chevy van, and this became the apex of conspiracy theory for Alvin and everyone in that household, that everybody was just out to get them.
Right.
And so suddenly I am a defeated politician. I served in the Georgia legislature for 4 terms. Ran for U.S. Congress in 1996 against a guy named Nathan Deal. Has anybody ever...
Don't know that guy.
Anybody knows? Well, of course, he went on to serve as our governor for 2 terms. Yeah. But it was a butt whipping. I was completely shut down, and it was a real, personal loss for me. Now I look back on it, it's the best thing that ever happened to me.
Yeah.
But Alvin was such an unusual person that he frightened people. He was the boogeyman to some people who grew up their parents threatening their children with, Alvin Ridley's going to get you if you don't come inside, and those kind of references. Alvin, interestingly enough, my father liked him. And my father always kind of dealt with outsiders. He really enjoyed doing business with outsiders. One, he could save a few bucks, but secondly, he just kind of related to them. And Alvin was our TV man. And so he was at our house fixing our horizontal hold and different things. This was for young people in the day where everything was analog. These were radio spectrum waves coming through the air and being captured by an antenna and interpreted through a cathode ray tube and interpreted to your TV screen. And there was a lot that could break down. And Alvin applied his trade. And nobody, I have not found anybody who says he was not a good picture tube TV repairman.
But he was one of those small town eccentric characters. You know, the way you describe him, and this really kind of the similarity in his name, it's kind of a Boo Radley character.
Interesting connection.
Yeah.
But very much misunderstood, odd by typical standards. There's a hint. Because I only found out 3 years ago that Alvin is neurodivergent. He is on the autism spectrum. Looking back, nobody talked about adult autism 25 years ago.
Right.
There was talk of autism, but there was a lot of energy being spent with what's causing this in our children. There's a lot of energy spent on that. In fact, autism has been with us since mankind began. Some of our biggest contributors have been on the spectrum, both in the arts and in literature and in science. And now we almost all know someone who is now identified to be on the autism spectrum. I have a theory that the classic small town Southern Gothic character who is eccentric is probably, they're all based on somebody who was not diagnosed on the autism spectrum.
That's a dissertation, right?
Yes, yes. But I think so. Things can be explained. A lot of times people can't be explained. And I suffered from that through the telling of a very interesting story. Anybody who would listen to me, podcasts, TV shows, Forensic Files, American Justice, People Magazine, the Washington Post, they all came wanting to hear this very fascinating story. And I gave it to them, but I left unsatisfied. And when a juror from the case suggested through another podcaster that she had become a nurse and she's wondering out loud, is Alvin autistic? The minute she said it, the scales fell from my eyes. It made sense because now I was armed with the knowledge of 2 decades of experiencing people who were diagnosed. And unlike 25 and 27 years ago when I began to represent Alvin, when I didn't have that, I wrote this making sure that I maintained the ignorance that I had about autism throughout the trial. And what I'm most proud of, I think, is the teachers and families of loved ones who are neurodivergent, their reaction to this book. Because I just told it as it was, and all the laughs are at my expense. My struggle to understand Alvin and what was motivating him. But Virginia was also a very unusual character.
The wife.
Yes.
Yes. Well, tell us about her, because a lot of her choices were mysterious as well.
Absolutely. Well, from childhood, she had severe epilepsy. Unfortunately, occasionally, she would also have a bad reaction to the medicines for her epilepsy. Her family dealt with it from her when she was 9 years old until she married at 18. And then Alvin and her dealt with it. At some point, she got mad at her family. They raided their public housing apartment in Ringgold looking for beer. They thought this military man might be corrupting their daughter with beer. They found no beer, but the insult was in place. And another thing happened that had nothing to do with Virginia's family, but an exterminator was let into the apartment while Virginia was in the bath. And it so disturbed her, plus he asked her out on a date. It so disturbed her that instead of confrontation, Alvin and Virginia would just leave the apartment every day and stay with his family a lot more, or Virginia would be dropped off with different various people in the community, none of whom mentioned this during the trial. I'm only learning this after the book came out, that Virginia used to stay with somebody's mama. Or
Would have been useful.
Yeah, it would have been very useful. And even one of Virginia's cousins showed up at a book signing saying, you know, Virginia said she didn't ever want to see her parents again. And I thought, I could have used you 25 years ago when he was accused of keeping her captive in a basement. But what was fascinating, and I only found this 5 weeks before the trial, because of a turkey plate my parents made me take Alvin for Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
He had been keeping me from his house and coming into his house for 13 months. I show up with the turkey plate, and I realize now Alvin is very transactional. He wanted to give me something, and he said, come on in. And inside his house, I found what I estimate were 15 to 20,000 individual writings by Virginia Ridley. They were just about the most mundane things, and then there were some very deep thoughts and poetry. And it was fascinating. She had a kind of a fangirl obsession with Ron Howard from TV. She wrote a proposed script to the Unsolved Mysteries TV show about the taking of Alvin's van, which was taken during some of his litigation as counterclaims. And so it was just fascinating. They belonged together. What was even more fascinating was there was an eviction that her parents showed up to. So her parents obviously, by putting articles in the newspaper that said, parents seek married daughter.
Yeah.
And that was bookended by the 1998 tabloid, Sicko holds wife captive for 30 years before killing her.
Yeah.
So those were the bookends of Virginia Ridley's disappearance.
Well, apparently there were people in town who didn't realize she was, she existed.
I was one of them.
Yeah.
I was one of them. I made it my job because I was in the legislature and I was running for re-election every 2 years. I went to every house in Ringgold. I was proud of that. Yeah. Could never get anybody to the door on that one.
Yeah.
And of course, I knew it was where Alvin Ridley lived, so I knew he was somewhat reclusive himself.
And the charges occur when she dies and he is accused of killing her.
She had on her face and around her eyes and mouth what are called petechial hemorrhages. They are tiny pinpoint hemorrhages that are and can be associated with asphyxiation. Problem is, all of the medical literature also says don't assume manual asphyxiation.
Yeah.
This can also happen during a seizure or during a coughing fit or anything that creates pressure up in the head, a higher blood pressure up in the head. So it came down to the need to have another epilepsy death to compare it to. A tragic coincidence was the death of Olympic track star Florence Griffith Joyner, or FloJo as she was popularly known.
Oh.
The world's fastest woman at one time. She died. There's not a lot known about her seizure disorder. I didn't know it until there was an announcement in October of 1998 that she died from a seizure disorder. I immediately knew I had to get her autopsy, and I got it. and it was extremely similar to Virginia Ridley's, even their arm positions. Flojo, as she was known, died sleeping on her front. Alvin discovered Virginia sleeping on her front after she had earlier had a seizure in the night and told him that she was okay.
We need to take a break. I know you're not going to go away. We've got a lot more to discuss with our guest, McCracken Poston, so stay with us.
Most affordable bachelor's degree in Northwest Georgia is right here at Georgia Highlands College. High quality and career focused. That's what you can expect at GHC. Apply today at highlands.edu.
Welcome back to Community Watch. I'm having a conversation with McCracken Poston, attorney and author. His book, Zenith Man, Death, Love, and Redemption in a Georgia Courtroom, just out this year, a few months ago, so you can get it, and you should, because it's a great read. In the first segment, you really just gave us kind of the setup for the arrest. But the book, I mean, that story, and as you say, some people may say that sounds familiar because there have been articles and segments on different shows about this story. But Alvin's arrest and his life with his wife, Virginia, is really, for me, the reader, just one piece of the book.
True.
It is just as much your story. This case happening to you at the time that it did.
Yes.
And you mentioned the political race.
Yes.
But also where your practice was at the time and your personal life. There's all of that comes together at kind of a remarkable juncture.
And I didn't plan to put all that stuff in.
Yeah.
I was simply trying to find and remember a date where I took Alvin to see my parents. My parents always had a calming effect on Alvin, and I had an Alvin that was not very calm at first. But I knew that he liked my parents, and I knew my parents were kind to him. So one day I just said, let's ride up to Graysville and see my parents. Well, I was trying to remember when that happened. And one of my sisters said, well, I've got Mama's journals. My parents have both passed away. And none of us want to read Mama's journals because she wrote raw. And we were going through different things and divorces and things like that we just didn't want to relive.
Yeah.
But I said, well, let me just take a year of them and just try to figure out, because she noted things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And in it suddenly brought back to me that my sisters and I have 5 older sisters.
Mm.
My sisters and I had finally put our foot down, and we had done an intervention for my father for his alcoholism. And my dad was a wonderful man, never abusive, never difficult for our mother and us, but just pitifully alcoholic. Never missed a day of work as far as I know. So it was always on the off time. And when you're a kid, you look inward and you think, well, what is it about me that's driving my dad to drink?
Mm-hmm.
And so you become a bit of a neurotic micromanager, child of an alcoholic parent. And I that started just the realization and the memory of that, reading my mother's journal, made me write it in my first draft of manuscript, because I remembered talking to my dad about Alvin when he was in the hospital.
Yeah.
They had given him Ambien, and he was kind of acting crazy, which was never how he acted when he was drinking. So I had to go and sit with him overnight, and he sobered up the next day and was coming down off of that. And I just told him, I said, I'm talking to Alvin Ridley. They're looking into his wife's death, wife none of us knew he had. And my dad said something that stuck with me. He said, son, he's a good man. He's just different. He just thinks different. And, of course, that was a precursor to the realization that Alvin is autistic, which only happened 3 years ago.
Right.
And so that explained a lot about myself. Maybe I wasn't the best personality to be matched with Alvin Ridley because I wanted things to be calm and smooth and normal. And so while I was having a problem interpreting Alvin, now I know he was having a problem interpreting me. And Alvin's very autistic mannerism set was actually being used against him at trial. Yeah. His flat vocal effect, the fact that his emotions didn't seem to meet the moment. And that was being used against him by the state of Georgia at trial.
Right. But I cannot imagine any other attorney taking the time to care about him the way you clearly did.
Well, my dad liked him.
Yeah.
My dad encouraged me to help him. But the one thing that kind of steeled my resolve, Alvin, and later I learned Virginia, for every ounce of suspicion they had about local government, they had pounds of hope from the federal government. And this kept revealing itself during the representation. At one point, Alvin bolted from a courtroom where I wanted him to sit there and be taking notes on jurors from a case I had to try before his. He bolted from the courtroom, came down here to Rome, and charged into the federal courthouse. The U.S. Marshals said they felt he had doused himself with gasoline. They didn't know what he was going to do. As it turned out, his car had just broken down on the way, but he ran into Judge Vining's office screaming that his lawyer in Ringgold hasn't knocked his case out yet. And so I had to deal with that humiliation. But it was another example of that was when I was sitting with him in my office and Congressman Nathan Deal called. Mm. Well, I hadn't talked to Nathan since he beat me soundly. And so I thought, well, maybe he's up for me giving him advice on something. And then I thought, no, it's not about that. So I went ahead and returned the call at Alvin's urging. The call was to tell me, keep Alvin Ridley away from my congressional office. He's scaring the ladies there. And so I had to figure out a way to break this to Alvin that didn't make me look like I'm on the team that's against him.
Right.
And so I came up with a little white lie. I said, Alvin, what Congressman Deal was talking about, he hates me so much. He said if you or I, either one of us, showed up at his congressional offices, he's going to have us both arrested. I felt like misery would love company. And I said, Alvin, if you will just cooperate, because I couldn't get him to talk about his wife's death. He wanted to talk about the van being taken in 15 years before. Mm-hmm. I said, if you will just cooperate and help me help you and leave Congressman Deal's office alone, when this is all over, I'll show you where he lives. Mm. I never did, but that was kind of a inside, we'll show him. Yeah. And that calmed Alvin down, and it kept him from going to the congressional office, and it kept him from being arrested after I was put on notice that he was not to go. Right. And it was just a way I had to guess how Alvin would react to this kind of news and adjust the news to the point where he knew he was not the only one at risk. Yeah.
Well, in addition to Alvin's story and those charges and a story of your life during that time, another element that impressed me so much was the particulars of going through a trial in well, any trial, but especially a trial in a small town like Ringgold.
Yes.
You do it in such meticulous detail. I mean, I can't remember any book about a court case that goes into the kind of detail that you do, and it's honestly riveting.
Well,
because you go through every, and I have to ask you about this because I'm amazed how much detail you remember after so long.
oh no, that was a trial transcript.
Well,
Yeah.
and I assumed you had the transcript, but you also are able to give the background
of every witness.
of every witness, and you're thinking through it, and it really is pretty remarkable.
Well, thank you. But one could argue that I wrote half a book because I put the trial, and I had to cut the trial, but I put the key elements of the trial and the key people. I felt terrible because there were some of our witnesses that were wonderful, but they, I was using them as filler because I didn't have an expert witness yet, but I just threw them up there, and unfortunately, my first draft on a 90,000 word book contract, my first draft weighed in at 177,000 words. So I almost wrote 2 books.
Yeah.
So I had to start hacking away at story. And they were telling me, hey, leave the stuff in about your father. And I was thinking, well, that's more story that I got to hack away of the trial.
Right.
So, I did utilize the trial transcript to keep from getting sued. I didn't want to put words in anybody's mouth that they didn't say. And so I used the trial transcript, but I had to cut out a lot of the more, boring parts. But I also felt the need to explain to the reader, this is why this is important.
Yeah.
But every word said in the courthouse was true, and from the stand was true.
Well, you apparently did some really effective editing because as a reader, I don't get any kind of choppiness or sense of, something's missing here.
Thank you.
And I found it fascinating, not just to get, what the witnesses did or said during the trial, but your observations about, your reaction to when they said this, or your thinking about one witness over another.
I was very stressed out.
Well,
and Alvin was amazing. I'm setting up here for your readers a couple of QR codes.
I don't know if they can.
Yeah, I bet they can.
But they might.
There's a couple. One's from Amazon. The other is from my publisher. And if they can hold their phones up against them, they might just find their way to the book.
I think they need to go immediately to wherever they buy books. And yes, McCracken Poston, there aren't too many. There may be some other stories about Alvin out there, but
well, at bookstores, this will be the only McCracken Poston book. There is another Zenith Man book, which is a fictionalized short story of our case. A Pennsylvania TV repairman whose wife hasn't been seen for 30 years. And the Zenith Man title came from a brief interest and announcement by New Line Cinema of a feature film about our case. That was 20 years ago.
Wow.
That they dropped the ball on that. Naturally I would love to see something like that, but in time perhaps.
Mike, we are out of time. Thank you so much for being on the show. And seriously, folks, you need to look up the book by McCracken Poston, Zenith Man, Death, Love, and Redemption in the Georgia Courtroom. You will really enjoy this.
Or try these QR codes.
Or try the QR. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next time on Community Watch.